Afternoon. Hope everybody's doing okay. We're in the kind of the middle of the Corona time. I'm Mr. Crawford, as you're probably aware, and today we're going to be talking about the subject of the civil rights movement here. If you'll go ahead and have the questions that you have assigned with this open, and you can probably do most of this while you just sit here and watch this video here. Let me get rid of that thing down at the bottom here. Okay. Some of this stuff we've been over already, some in class, and you might notice right away that I'm not Mrs. Longoria. That's okay. I've used her PowerPoint though. She made a good one here, so it's kind of short and to the point, shorter than some of the ones I usually use and everything. So we're going to kind of go over some stuff. You probably do need to listen to the sound on this because some of the stuff I'll just say. I'm going to encourage you at some points to go ahead and Google some stuff in a separate window. You don't have to do it right this instant, but it's, to get more things. And of course, anytime you find anything you want to know more about there and everything. I also encourage you, that first list of stuff that the district kind of set out, for students to do before I started putting lessons on Canvas. One of the things in there, and I had a couple of people that did this, and it was really cool. If you have a relative or somebody you know or a family friend who lived through any of the things we talk about, civil rights, we're going to talk about Vietnam later, the 70s, 80s, or 90s there and everything. Feel free to talk to those people. You'd be surprised at how much stuff they'll tell you, and except for in the Vietnam case. Some people don't want to talk about that. So of course respect them if that's how they feel about it. But you might have relatives that remember things about the civil rights, and that not just African American students. I think that a lot of cases, there's people of all races and things will and everything will remember parts of this. It starts out with a picture of a girl drinking from a colored only. We'll go back to the roots of that whole thing and where that started and everything. There's also one of the questions on there talks about a mistake that was made in this thing, and it's not a big deal, but I'd like you to see if you can figure the mistake out and everything. If you can't, Google it. If you get, I'll tell you when it's about Jackie Robinson. There's some information that most people just assume is true, and it's actually not. So anyway, we'll see if we can figure that out. If you can't, just leave it blank. It's not a huge deal, but I like to encourage you to see if you can find that when we get to it. You'll see where it is in just a minute. So anyway, civil rights. Go to. There we go. Civil rights, you need to know kind of the definition of civil rights, and that's that idea of these unquestionable rights, or in other words, rights that everybody is supposed to have. And we see when we start talking about this, that's not necessarily the case. These 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments all took place right after the Civil War, which is shown right there. I believe that's one of your questions. And right in the years just after the Civil War, those are called the Civil Rights Amendments. And they sound like a big deal, and they are. However, most of those rights started going away piece by piece by other means, that we'll talk about here in a few minutes. Jim Crow laws are laws that are after the Civil War, about 30 years after the Civil War. There's a court case we're going to talk about in just a second, which required segregation of public facilities like buses, restrooms, restaurants, schools, movie theaters, parks, and just about anything. And that segregation is just where you separate by race there and everything. And that was in place officially in the United States starting in 1896, and then it continued. Officially, it ends in 1954, but in reality, it ends really in the late 1960s. It dragged on for a few years. The desegregation of schools took until the 1970s in some cases. There's two different types of segregation that are shown there. There's segregation that's required by law, which is what this was, and then de facto segregation is where it's just a custom that races are separate. And we still have that in the United States. Churches usually, usually have separate congregations, not because it's a law, just because that's what people are more comfortable with. So sometimes it's harder to change de facto segregation than it is de jure desegregation, that first one there. Jim Crow law started with the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896, and that's the one where they said it was okay to have those separate but equal facilities. Jim Crow himself was a kind of a racist puppet show character, is shown right there. That's what the laws are named after. So anyway, and it's shown right here. Some other things you see that they would only hire a white worker. There's a colored waiting room. there. By the way, if you're a Hispanic student or any other race besides white or African American, anybody who wasn't white would have been called colored back then. That's how they got around that. NAACP is an organization it's shown there. It was actually founded by W.E.B. Du Bois back in the early 1900s, and they challenged segregation in court. So they worked on it, and it's still an organization today. Unfortunately, there was some racially motivated violence. I'm going to warn you about a couple of the pictures that come up there. One thing, it's going to ask you about this concept of extrajudicial killings. What does that mean? It means that there was no trial. That's usually what a lynching involves, is no trial by the person they think is guilty. Because a lot of times it wasn't that the person was guilty; they just didn't like the person. So, and it's obviously a very racially motivated crime in most cases there. Some images there. I'll go through those quick. Emmett Till, in some ways, this is what got the movement started. Emmett Till he was accused. He was from Chicago, but his family had originally come from Mississippi. He went back to Mississippi to visit. He was accused of visiting whistling at a white woman, and he was killed. He's 14, I believe. And everything. His mother, which I'm not sure if that's his mother, it may not be, but she insisted on an open casket funeral, even though his body had been horribly disfigured. And she wanted folks to see what had actually happened when she sent him to the relative's house in Mississippi and what the conditions were. And it really started to make some changes in the country and everything. All that's most people think, well, at least I think that you don't have to know all these, but this one in the middle, I need you to know this executive order where Truman, who's right after World War II, desegregated the armed forces. And I think the reason that's such a big deal to me anyway, my opinion, is that that's the largest organization in the country, is the Armed Forces of the United States. So with that, if that's segregated, that means everything else in the country can be segregated. And this starts in 1948, starts that process there actually, I believe the year is 1946, but just be aware of what it was. Don't worry about the date so much. Here's the one with the mistake. In 1947, Jackie Robinson it says the first African American to play professional baseball. That's not exactly true, and I'd have you Google that and see if you can figure out what the mistake is. And it's kind of a minor point there and everything, but you should be aware that he's the first to, he is a pioneer in that field. And baseball was the biggest sport and everything. And you could see the results of it are shown right there. It sports, entertainment, business, and everything is some impacts that were made. Sweat versus Painter is a court case that had to do with a law school at the University of Texas, UT. Actually created a separate law school just so they wouldn't have to admit it. I don't think it does say he's African American. He is an African American student and everything. So this is anyway. That's the first court case involving schools. We'll get to the next one in a minute here. Don't worry about that. Brown versus Board of Education. This is one you've probably heard of before. This is the one where after this, schools were supposed to be desegregated or integrated after that. One thing I need you to remember as we go through this, that everything they ever do, anything the government does, there's what they say and then what actually happens, okay? And that's sometimes two different things. The Supreme Court and the United States government, in other words, said that segregation was to end in 1954 with this court case. Okay, it ends the segregation. But what I'm going to tell you is it doesn't. All it does is states just drag their feet on ending in integration and everything there. So just be aware. Just because it says something happened, that doesn't mean that's the day the schools actually integrate. That date's much later in many cases there. Anyway. Here's an example. This is the Little Rock crisis here, the Little Rock 9, where the governor sends in the National Guard to prevent integration. The president has to actually take over and force the school to integrate by sending Army troops there to Little Rock to force them to integrate. And this is after the school was already supposed to have integrated due to the Brown case there and everything. So anyway, you've probably heard of that before. There. Here's the Montgomery bus boycott. Again, these buses are supposed to have already been integrated, but they didn't. And Rosa Parks, gets taken to jail. There's a question about how long did the bus boycott that Martin Luther King organized, how long did that last? Because I always thought it was just a couple of weeks. And this is all before I was born, obviously. But it turned out it was more than a year. Which I wasn't aware until just a little while ago. Anyway, uh, believe that's all you're going to need for this one. And if you have any questions about anything, send me a message on Canvas or Remind or whatever. And all. But anyway, look forward to seeing you again soon. I'm not sure how much longer this thing's going to drag on, but hopefully you'll be able to wait till the time there, and we'll get to that. All right. I guess I'm going to sign off. Thank you very much.